Have you ever wondered what happened in the Middle Ages after the sun went down? When the fields emptied, the tools were put away, and the great castles and tiny cottages alike fell silent? Most people imagine medieval life as endless noise, clanging blacksmiths, roaring feasts, and grim battles. But the truth is, the quiet hours after sunset held a completely different side of history. It was a time when the world slowed, when even the poorest peasant could find peace by the hearth, and when sleep itself followed rhythms we've long forgotten in this calm journey through the night. We'll explore what people really did after dark, how they prayed, rested, dreamed, and found meaning in silence. From the flicker of firelight on stone monastery walls to the soft murmur of peasants sharing bread in a one-room cottage. This is the story of how medieval people found serenity in a world without electricity, clocks, or hurry, so settle in, let your thoughts drift back in time, and discover what truly happened after sunset in the Middle Ages. When the sun slipped below the western edge of the horizon in the medieval world, a hush began to settle across the land like a great, invisible blanket. The final amber light faded from the sky. The clouds caught their last glimmer of gold, and shadows lengthened over the fields that had been busy all day with the slow, repetitive rhythm of human labor. It was the hour when tools were laid down, the oxen unyoked, and the voices of the village softened into murmurs. There was a particular peace to the medieval evening that few people today could imagine. It was not the kind of peace found in silence alone, but in the slowing of the entire world, when every task, every heartbeat, and every breath seemed to align with the natural rhythm of dusk. The day's toil ended, and what followed was not excitement or noise, but a gentle, predictable descent into rest. Inside a small thatched cottage, the faint orange glow of the hearth flickered across rough-hewn beams. Smoke drifted lazily through a gap in the roof, escaping into the cool air outside. A woman stirred a pot of pottage, a thin stew made from barley, leeks, and whatever greens she could find in the garden. The aroma was humble but comforting, earthy and familiar. Her husband sat nearby, rubbing the dirt from his hands, his eyes heavy but content. Around them, the children dozed in corners, curled up in straw-stuffed mattresses, warmed by the faint heat of the fire. This was the hour of simplicity, no more plowing, no mending of fences, no loud shouting across the fields. The chickens had roosted, the pigs lay in their pens, and even the dogs were quiet. There was only the faint crackle of firewood, the rhythmic creak of an old stool, and the occasional sigh of wind through the shutters. Outside, the world darkened quickly. The medieval night came without the soft gradient of modern electric light. One moment, there was twilight. The next, near total darkness. The only illumination came from the moon, if it chose to show itself, or from stars that gleamed like shards of broken glass across the ink-black sky. To those who lived in that world, night was alive, full of sound and scent and quiet movement. Villagers believed the night held both peace and mystery. It was a time when the boundaries between the living and the unseen thinned. Old stories told by the fire spoke of wandering spirits, of fair folk who walked the meadows after dark, of ancestors who watched from the shadows. But for most people, these tales were not frightening. They were part of the rhythm of life, reminders that rest and mystery belonged together. Meals were eaten slowly, with gratitude rather than haste. A family might sit together in silence, occasionally murmuring prayers of thanks. Bread, coarse and hard, was dipped in the warm stew. Ale was poured sparingly, not for indulgence but for comfort. It was said that even the poorest man could feel rich for a moment when he sat by his own hearth with food and warmth at hand. Once supper was done, the coals in the hearth were banked, covered lightly with ash to preserve the embers for morning. The faint orange glow lingered, breathing gently in the dark. In that half-light, people often prayed, whispered, or simply stared into the fire, their thoughts drifting like smoke. There was a sense that time slowed down after sunset. The day's obligations dissolved, leaving only the essentials: warmth, quiet, and the closeness of others. This in-between period, when the world was fully dark and still, was called the Watch. It was a time of intimacy and contemplation, when families and neighbors felt the deep silence that surrounded them. Then, as fatigue returned, they would slip into their second sleep, a softer, lighter rest that lasted until the first pale streaks of dawn touched the thatch and fields once again. Even the church followed this rhythm. In monasteries scattered across Europe, monks rose several times through the night to chant prayers in candlelit choirs. The great stone abbeys echoed with the low hum of voices, Gregorian chants drifting up into the rafters like smoke. This discipline was known as the night office or matins, and it reminded both monks and peasants alike that rest and worship were intertwined. Silence, they believed, was not emptiness, but fullness, a space where the divine could speak. In these stone monasteries, night was not idle. The flicker of oil lamps illuminated the pages of handwritten manuscripts, as monks carefully copied text by hand, not for glory or gain, but as acts of devotion. The smell of ink mixed with wax and parchment. Outside, the wind moaned through cloisters, carrying the scent of damp earth. It was peaceful work, slow and eternal, matching the pulse of the medieval world. Meanwhile, in the castles and manors of the nobility, evening took on a different rhythm. As servants cleared the remains of dinner, roasted meats, bread trenchers, and cups of spiced wine, the great hall dimmed into soft firelight. Lutes and harps provided gentle music, their notes rising and falling like breath. Conversation was quiet, polite, and meandering. Nobles often passed time by reading aloud from illuminated manuscripts, or by listening to travelers tell tales of distant lands. Some noblewomen spent their evenings tending to indoor gardens or arranging herbs. Rosemary, sage, and lavender were grown not only for cooking but for fragrance and medicine. The scent of these herbs filled the air, soothing and familiar. It was said that lavender placed near one's pillow invited calm dreams. The gardens of castles were often walled and secluded, places of peace rather than beauty, where the hum of bees and the trickle of small fountains replaced the noise of court life. As the fires burned lower, the noble household retreated to chambers lit by candles. Servants laid fresh rushes on the floors, replaced linens, and closed wooden shutters against the cold. Sleep came slowly, but comfortably. In these upper chambers, the air smelled faintly of beeswax, flowers, and smoke, a blend that, centuries later, still lingers in descriptions of medieval peace. For travelers and pilgrims on the road, however, the medieval night was a different experience altogether. Inns were rare and often crowded, with shared straw beds and restless animals underfoot. Yet even here, a kind of quiet camaraderie prevailed. Strangers shared bread and stories, each person grateful simply for shelter and warmth. Outside, the forests were vast and black, the roads winding and empty. The sound of the wind through trees became a constant companion, lulling weary travelers to uneasy but necessary rest. It might seem strange that people of the Middle Ages, who lived with so much hardship and uncertainty, found calm in such simple routines. But perhaps it was precisely this hardship that gave their peace its depth. When every meal, every tool, and every beam of firelight had to be earned, gratitude came naturally. Rest was not a luxury. It was part of survival. The medieval world moved slowly. There was time to mend, to listen, to wait. When darkness came, it was accepted rather than resisted. People did not chase it away with endless light or sound. They welcomed it, for it meant the day's work was over. The night restored the rhythm of life in the quiet of their cottages and monasteries. People listened to the world's softer voices. The creak of wood in the rafters, the gentle snore of livestock, the flutter of a bat's wings outside the window, all of these became part of the nightly symphony. Children fell asleep to these sounds, as comforting as any lullaby. Even the simplest acts had meaning. stirring ashes to keep the hearth warm, folding a wool cloak neatly before lying down, pouring a little water into a wooden bowl to wash one's hands. These gestures, repeated night after night, formed the heartbeat of medieval life. They were ordinary, perhaps even dull, yet in their repetition lay peace. In the quiet of their cottages and monasteries, people listened to the world's softer voices. The creak of wood in the rafters, the gentle snore of livestock, the flutter of a bat's wings outside the window, all of these became part of the nightly symphony. Children fell asleep to these sounds, as comforting as any lullaby. Even the simplest acts had meaning. Stirring ashes to keep the hearth warm, folding a wool cloak neatly before lying down, pouring a little water into a wooden bowl to wash one's hands. These gestures, repeated night after night, formed the heartbeat of medieval life. They were ordinary, perhaps even dull, yet in their repetition lay peace. Time itself seemed to move differently after sunset. Without mechanical clocks or the glow of screens, people measured hours by instinct, by the crackling of firewood, the length of a candle's burn, or the song of night creatures. The medieval night taught patience. It taught stillness. It reminded humanity that the world, for all its noise by day, was meant to rest. In villages across Europe, from the misty fields of England to the sun-drenched hills of Italy, the same pattern repeated every evening. The last tools were hung, the doors were barred, and prayers were whispered. The sound of bells from a distant church marked the beginning of Compline, the final prayer of the day. And as the echo faded, each soul, rich or poor, surrendered to the darkness, trusting that dawn would come again. In that trust lay the secret of medieval calm. It was not that life was easy or free from fear. Famine, illness, and loss were constant companions. Yet when the sun set, people knew how to stop. They knew how to sit quietly beside a fire and be still. Their peace did not depend on comfort, but on acceptance. The peasants slept on straw. The monks prayed in cold stone. The nobles rested on feather beds beneath embroidered canopies. But the night belonged equally to all. It softened the divisions of class and labor, reminding everyone that in the dark, every life slowed to the same rhythm. If you could travel back and stand in the middle of a medieval village after sunset, you might be struck not by noise, but by the vastness of quiet. The stars above would shimmer with a brilliance modern eyes have forgotten. The air would smell of smoke and soil and fresh-cut hay. From one cottage, you might hear the faint murmur of a bedtime prayer. From another, the low hum of a lullaby. And beyond the fields, the gentle hoot of an owl echoing across the valley. It was, in its own way, a perfect kind of peace. A peace not built from wealth or progress, but from rhythm, simplicity, and the shared understanding that night was not an enemy, but a companion. As the embers faded and the world slipped into shadow, there was nothing to do but listen to the breath of the wind, the slow beating of one's heart, and the steady pulse of a world at rest. And perhaps that is what we've forgotten most about the Middle Ages. Not their hardships, nor their violence, but their patience. They knew how to wait. They knew how to let the world go quiet. They knew that peace was not found in the absence of struggle, but in the acceptance of it, the simple knowledge that the sun would rise again, just as it always had. So when the fire dimmed and the last voice whispered its goodnight, the medieval world drifted not into sleep alone, but into a kind of unity, a shared surrender to darkness. The villages, monasteries, and castles all lay wrapped beneath the same blanket of stars. The earth rested, humanity rested, and for a few hours, until the first bird sang and the first light touched the fields, the world was still. Thank you for drifting through history with me tonight. I hope this quiet journey through the peaceful side of medieval life helped you unwind and maybe even see the past in a gentler light. Here at Quiet Boring Sleep, we believe that even the calmest, Most ordinary parts of history can tell us something beautiful about being human, about work, rest, and the small moments that made up entire lives centuries ago. If you enjoyed this slow, sleepy exploration, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss our next quiet story from the past. Until next time, rest well, dream deeply, and remember, even history can be soothing when told slowly.